very happy to be part of the Banning Conference. So first off, if you haven't read the little blurb, NorSC is a group of museum professionals and academics and others dedicated to researching and interpreting the history of enslaved people and the practice of enslaved people in the northern United States. So today, the four of us are going to give a little introduction to NorSC, how we got started, and then each of us is going to talk a little bit about our particular organization. So the four of us are members of the steering committee of the Northern Slavery Collective, and we're here to talk about the mission of our organization, et cetera. We're going to share some of the work we've done, and we hope we're going to allow a bunch of time at the end. And part of the core mission of NorSC is to have members and others share their work and share their ideas, share their problems relating to interpreting and researching the history of enslavement in the North. So we're going to allow a whole bunch of time at the end for you're going to get to know us, and we'd like to get to know you as well. So we are a relatively new organization. We got our start in February of 2020, just before the COVID pandemic disrupted everyone. Our very first meeting included about 30 people and was held in the old Dutch barn at Phillipsburg Manor in Tarrytown, Sleepy Hollow. We were brought together to hear stories from people at those historic sites around the lower Hudson Valley, upper New Jersey, and southwestern Connecticut, sites that had a particular common interest. They were all in the process of, or had recently completed, or were about to start a reinterpretation of their site or programming based on the history of enslaved people. Our goal at this first meeting was to describe what was happening in our respective organizations, about how the history of enslavement in the North was affecting our organizations, how it was changing our programming, and how we and the programming was relating to our public. There was a lot of energy in that room, in that barn. And a subsequent meeting over the summer reinforced our understanding that there was a need to take that energy and move forward somehow collectively. The tragic reality is that the history of slavery in the United States is still inadequately taught and understood. It remains true that most people in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and elsewhere in the North do not even know that slavery existed here. Do not know that slavery existed here, right in their own backyards. New York State did not finally abolish slavery until 1827, but the indentures that ensued from that meant that there were African Americans held to service until at least 1848, if not longer. New Jersey didn't officially end slavery until the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. Who knows that? Who knows that? Lending a sense of urgency to these meetings in 2020 was the growing protest movement that was sweeping the country in the wake of the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, all in the same year. Our shared work on Northern slavery and its repercussions today has been crucial to the American conversation. And it's tragic to think that it took our country's recent history to get more people to pay attention to our earlier history. Thus, the reinterpretation of our history, an interpretation that fronts the experiences, successes, and challenges that faced the enslaved Black men, and women in the North. That's one of the hallmarks of the NorSC work. Sites around the New York tri-state area and even further afield are using new research and new findings to change or add to their respective former interpretations. This is a key group of organizations that would be interested and attracted to NorSC. For example, this past February, 3 years almost to the day of our first meeting in that barn, we held an inaugural convention hosted by Phillips Manor Hall in Yonkers. We had over 100 live attendees and at least as many through Zoom and other digital media. So that's the second leg of our mission, is to provide a forum for sites and organizations to discuss their work, seek answers and ideas, and make connections with others engaged in similar work. We want to provide a sounding board for other historic sites and related groups who are engaged in the interpretation or reinterpretation of their sites based on new research about the history of enslavement. As just one quick aside, Phillipsburg Manor, where we held this conference, in that barn, they were interpreting enslavement of the 23 men and women who worked at that mill and manor house. That was the third interpretation of that site. After interpreting it for Frederick Phillips and then interpreting it for the workers who rented property, the tenant farmers, finally they got around to interpreting it from the vantage of the enslaved people. So we formally established ourselves in the summer of 21, and we currently have over 40 sites and related organizations who are participating and signed on. We have a Facebook group and page which can be used to share ideas, events, questions, challenges related to interpretation, etc. We're still in the early stages, and that's why it's great for us to be here today, and we're thankful for that, so more people and organizations can get to know who we are. We reach out as well to sites, educational communities with the goal of fostering understanding of the forgotten stories of enslaved people. Our public-facing goal in the end is to crush the myth that slavery did not exist in the North or was mild in comparison to slavery in the South. So in response to questions and feedback we've received so far, we'll be scheduling some new program and related sessions over the coming months. So for example, we're going to be hosting some networking event for members. And I should mention Melissa Kiewit, who is the acting director at the Dyckman House. Her organization is going to help to host these. There'll be some in-person events in July, et cetera, and you can find out more about that. We're also inaugurating a NorSC talk series, and we might want to find a better name for that, but kind of tells what we're up to. So those will happen in August, September, and October. There'll be virtual events lasting about an hour to an hour and a half. In reaction or in response to surveys from our first conference, we'll be creating flyers in a Google Drive to send out to members. There'll be a folder where all of you can share information or questions. We'll also be sending up an email notification for you to share information with the group. And we're going to be working on a guide to decolonizing language, in museums. That's a whole big topic. Some of you are nodding your head, so I know you're familiar with decolonizing language. So we'll be happy to answer questions about NorSC in general when we get through each of us talking a little bit about our particular sites. I'm going to start since I've got the floor, and then we'll move on. So I'm executive director of the Mid-Hudson Anti-Slavery History Project. We are not an historic site, but the work we do, we might envision it as a site writ large. In 2006, a group of researchers, historians, and community activists came together to find the history of slavery, anti-slavery, and the Underground Railroad, both its people and events across Dutchess County and the entire Mid-Hudson Valley area. If you're not familiar, Dutchess County is about midway between New York City and Albany on the eastern shore of the Hudson. Dutchess's history is interesting. It experienced explosive population growth in the mid-1700s into the early 1800s, driven to a great extent from the use of enslaved workers. The economy coming out of New York City, which was essentially working as part of the whole the Eastern Seaboard slave economy, was pulling wheat, flour, butter, other goods from the Hudson Valley area to send down to work to feed those in the southern colonies as well as the West Indies. We have a broad range of names, buildings, events for the enslaved people, their owners. The role of churches is extremely important. The spread of anti-slavery societies, violence committed by those opposed to abolition, and the like. We published a guidebook several years ago, which includes information about each of these aspects. The second part of our mission is to interpret this local history within the context of the fight over slavery playing out on the national stage. So we track the development of new African-American churches. For example, the AME Zion churches who broke away from the original mixed white Methodist churches in the 1820s and 1830s. Poughkeepsie, the county seat, was home to one of the most famous cases from the fugitive slave law, coming out of the fugitive slave law in 1850, when a local tailor was arrested and sent back to his owner in South Carolina. In another example of this national connection, the congressman who introduced language to prohibit slavery in the new Missouri state, James Talmadge, was a native of Dutchess County. So we make it our mission to place this local history in the broad context of racial slavery in the New World, et cetera. And while that work continues, we're playing a role in helping unify historical approaches, organizations, and site work around both history and commemoration. We are working in collaboration with a Poughkeepsie organization called Celebrating the African Spirit on a project that is looking forward to the bicentennial of the end of enslavement in New York. So Project 2027, we're working with them. We are also one of the first members of a statewide organization called the Underground Railroad Coalition, New York State, and there's a couple of other of us here in the audience today. The focus there is primarily on the Underground Railroad, but IRCNES as well is beginning to look at different types of programming or projects that we might undertake to help bring notice to this important event. We're supporting the use of decolonizing language. It's extremely important to use terms like enslaved people rather than slave. We need to reflect the essential humanity and agency of Africans and African descendants who suffered under the economic system and racialized slavery. Promoting education is another issue here. We mentioned at the beginning the importance of recognizing that slavery existed in the North On the other hand, it wasn't the same kind of slavery that existed in the South, but a number of its features, such as buying and selling without any notice, breaking up families, severe punishment with no restrictions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those were features that were common both North and South. And one final issue for us is, I kind of hinted at it, there was nothing easy or easier about enslavement in the North. For us personally, that's a misunderstanding of what the nature of slavery is. The essential nature of slavery is that it has taken away, or it has attempted to take away, what is essentially human about the person. Oh, well, slavery was nicer in the North. It wasn't as bad. That's a misunderstanding of what it means to be enslaved. So we need to try to keep working on those issues as well. So I'll stop there regarding Mid-Hudson anti-slavery, and I'm going to pass it off to Meredith. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Move this closer because I don't have your height.
Go ahead.
You're much taller than me. Hi, I'm Meredith Horsford. I am currently the executive director of the Historic House Trust of New York City, which is an organization, kind of service organization that serves as a liaison between 23 historic sites that are in New York City parks, including the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum, and the New York City Parks Department, which owns these sites. But today, I'm here to speak as I was just finished working at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum in February and started the Historic House Trust then. So today I'm going to be talking about the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. So if you have not been, the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum is a 1784 Dutch colonial site in the neighborhood of Inwood in Upper Manhattan. It's on 204th Street and Broadway. Come visit. And it's a really interesting site that looks absolutely nothing like the rest of the community. That was originally not part of New York City when the house was built in the late 1700s. And so New York City kind of grew up around it. So when you look around the neighborhood, it is all buildings that were built in the 1900s, except for the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. So it really stands out. So I started working at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum in 2015, and I started reaching out to peers in the community, people who did public programming that might be similar to what we were doing. And I realized that no one knew that the Dyckman Farmhouse was a museum. People thought I lived there, that it was just my house. So that was interesting. And so that really told me we had a lot to do in terms of community engagement. So to kind of set the stage a little bit about the site, we are in a community that is largely about 70% or more Spanish speaking. And the museum, prior to me arriving, had everything in English. Exclusively everything was in English. So that's obviously a real communication problem right there. So there were a few things that we did to kind of just change the feel of the museum. There were these metal room barriers that allowed you to just kind of step in one step and say, oh, what a lovely chair. And then you keep going because there's nothing else to see. All of the communication was in English. And it was really, really dark in the museum. You entered this little historic cave, basically. So we got rid of the room barriers and allowed people to come into the rooms. We changed the lighting so that you could actually see things when you got into the rooms. And our director of education is a native Spanish speaker. So made sure that everything that we talked about in the museum in terms of room labels and, you know, any kind of information that you might read while you're there or take with you was always in English and Spanish, and made sure that all of the communications that we had in the community were also in English and Spanish, whether it's, you know, an event on Facebook or it's a flyer hanging in the local bodega window, that everything was bilingual. We also held bilingual programs. And the interpretation at the museum had always been, let's talk about the Dyckmans. It's the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. But what was really missing was, okay, well, what about everybody else, right? You know, the Dykmans had 250 acres of land and they farmed it all on their own. Wow, it was a miracle. You know, that doesn't make any sense. And so not only were we as a staff really, really interested in the rest of the history, like the real history, but we would also get visitors who would come in and ask, well, did the Dykmans have slaves? Were they nice to their slaves? And that's a hard question to answer with, you know, continuing to be polite. But we got all these questions. We didn't know very much about the enslaved history of the state. We knew that there were enslaved people living there and obviously working this 250-acre farm, but we really didn't know much about them. And so it was in 2019 that we were awarded a grant from the New York Community Trust, which really allowed us to hire someone. The Dyckman Farmhouse is a very small staff, to hire someone to work part-time for a year, conducting research on anything and everything that could be found in that period of time on people who were enslaved and free who lived on the property. And we uncovered 5 names throughout that process, which we use in programming. Their names are on a t-shirt. We talk about Harry and Will and Hannah and Francis and kind of what we know about them, which admittedly is not a ton, but it's a great opportunity for us to talk about the real rest of the history that was kind of going on at the museum or at what is now the museum in this time period. And we've used that information to influence public programs, to collaborate with peers in our community, and to really change what we talk about. We also received a grant from IMLS to completely revamp the interpretation of the museum. So we had started to kind of do that in 2019, but now with this grant from IMLS, that actually enabled us to bring on a consultant, bring on an advisory panel, and really engage with the community and talk to them about, well, you know, this is what we're going to be talking about at the museum. What interests you? What do you want to learn about? And through what mediums might you want to learn about it? So that's been really a great process to really engage the community in the conversation. And it really also helped us gain buy-in, both from the community, from elected officials, from the board, from the city. So we have a lot of kind of constituents that we're working with and engaging with on any given day. And so having these community conversations really enabled people to see what we're doing, give their feedback, and it enabled us to really get buy-in and for people to get engaged and interested and supportive of what we were doing. We also have been working with artists for many years in what is the last affordable neighborhood in Manhattan. And there are a lot of artists who live there. And so we've been working with artists for years to exhibit their specific contemporary work. But what we started to do in 2019, when we received the grant from the New York Community Trust, was to really kind of change the focus of the contemporary art exhibitions that we had at the museum, and to really start to engage artists to look at the enslaved history of the site and to create art that responded to that history. And what we found is not only was it wonderful to engage with a ton of artists in the community and see their amazing work in the middle of these historic period rooms. So obviously that really stands out to a visitor, right? Well, what is that? That doesn't look old. And so, but it really created a really wonderful entry point into a conversation about enslavement at the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum or in Manhattan with visitors in a way that was comfortable, that allowed people to ask questions and to start a conversation with one of us in a way that felt comfortable. About a topic that people don't necessarily always want to talk about. And one of our art installations was a pop-up that was a projection on the side of the museum during the pandemic when we were not open. And it said slaves lived here in English and Spanish. It was created by an artist. And it was, people knew it was going to be happening. And so some people came to see it. And some people just saw it because they were walking home from the grocery store or from the subway and stopped, and it really would grab you, right? And so people would stop, talk to us, talk to the artist. And that was another really interesting partnership that created a lot of great dialogue. And at installation specifically, we got a lot of really wonderful feedback. And then you're always going to get the internet trolls who are, you know, like, this happened such a long time ago. Why are you still talking about this? Can we move on? No, we can't. So those kinds of programs really, I think, helped the community get much more engaged in the work that we were doing. I think our staff obviously was really engaged in the work that we were doing, but it also helped kind of get our board more engaged in what we were doing. And throughout that process of kind of evolving what we were doing programmatically and how we were engaging the community, we were also really kind of evolving the board as well as we went along. It started off as, you know, a group of interested people who just loved this old house and one Dykeman descendant. And over time, we really started to incorporate people who were local business owners. You know, we really wanted the board to represent and to look like the people that we're serving in the community. So that also has really changed the organization. They're very supportive of the work that we're doing. And, you know, I sometimes like to tell a funny story that after that pop-up exhibition of Slaves Lived Here, the next morning, I got a phone call at like 8 o'clock in the morning from our Dykeman descendant board member. And I thought, he never calls me at 8 o'clock in the morning. I feel like this could be bad. We'll see. And I answered and he said, saw the exhibition. Long pause. And I spoke to my sister about it. Long pause. This is exactly the work we should be doing. So it was great to have that support. I didn't think he was going to say anything negative, but you know, you never know how that's going to go when you project Slaves Lived Here on the side of your kind of ancestral home.
At 8 o'clock in the morning.
At 8 o'clock the next morning, right? Usually calls at 8 a.m. are not good. So, you know, that's kind of a short synopsis of, I think, how the organization has evolved and how it has changed from being this small old house that apparently I live in to a really important part of the community that, you know, kids are coming to the organization summer camp, and we're partnering with the library on, you know, literacy programming. And so it's been a really interesting sort of ride that I'm excited to still sort of be a part of from the Historic House Trust point of view. And I'll turn it over to you, Donnamarie.
Okay. All right. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. This is a great crowd. My name's Donnamarie Barnes, and I'm the Director of History and Heritage at Sylvester Manor, which is on Shelter Island on the east end of Long Island. Sylvester Manor is considered to be the most intact plantation remnant north of Virginia. The island is the ancestral home of the indigenous Manhasset people who called it Manhansak Ahakwash Awamak, island sheltered by islands in the waters of Peconic Bay. We honor and acknowledge the Manhassets as ancestors of this land. When you enter a long drive to the manor, you can feel the outside world begin to shift away. You are surrounded by the sounds and the silence of the forest, and the senses are heightened with the sway of the trees and the smell of the woods and the water. A feeling of story is present, often without knowing anything about the place. Sylvester Manor is a place of history and of memory, whose essence has been held within the land itself over centuries and for generations. The English claimed Long Island for King Charles I in 1638, And in 1651, the 8,000 acres of Shelter Island was purchased for 1,600 pounds of muscovado sugar by 4 English partners, including the brothers Constance and Nathaniel Sylvester. It was to serve as a provisioning plantation for their sugar operations in Barbados in the West Indies. And from Barbados, they brought enslaved African men, women, and children to perform the labors of clearing and farming the land, raising livestock, harvesting timber for barrels, staves, to ship to Barbados, to the plantation, and to tend to the Sylvester house and their family. For 368 years, the property ownership passed through 11 generations of Sylvester descendants until Sylvester Manor Educational Farm was established in 2009, and the land gifted in 2014 to the nonprofit organization. Today, we're simply known as Sylvester Manor, and the organization is comprised of 236 acres of land, a Georgian-style manor house built in 1737, outbuildings, and the continuation of a working organic farm. Our mission is to cultivate, preserve, and share historic Sylvester Manor, telling the stories of all of the people who lived, worked, and died there, and sustaining the land for generations to come. Along that drive, on the driveway, there's a mighty oak that stands the fork before a circle of eastern white pine trees surrounding an empty space. And a large stone is placed beside the road that was placed there in 1886 by Sylvester descendants, and it reads, "Burying ground of the colored people of the manor from 1651. The stone acknowledges as many as 200 people buried anonymously in what we call the Afro-Indigenous burial ground. The grave mounds are barely discernible, with nearly 150 field stones in loose alignment marking the site. This we consider sacred ground. It is sacred ground of the indigenous Manhansett people who lost their ancestral home, and the enslaved and free people of color who were buried here for over 250 years. Telling the full story of all who lived, worked, and died here has always been a part of our mission and is included in all of our public narratives. Since 2022, with funding from the Mellon Foundation, we have been able to devote staff and resources to research our history with much greater depth and concentration than ever before. The results have been meaningful and exciting and extraordinarily emotional. As we've uncovered the identities and lives of enslaved and free people of color, some of whom we had no knowledge of previously. We've been able to trace family lineages from slavery to freedom at Sylvester Manor, Shelter Island, and the greater East End of Long Island. We have to date successfully confirmed the identities of over 60 people who we know were laid to rest in the unmarked graves of the Afro-Indigenous burial ground. In addition to the research at the burial ground of the people who are interred there, since 2021, we have been engaged in a partnership project with the archaeological team from the University of Massachusetts at Boston and the Fisk Center for Archaeological Research, and members of the Shinnecock Tribal Nation Graves Protection Warrior Society and representatives of descendants of tribal people of Long Island, to scientifically study the boundaries and topography of the Afro-Indigenous burial ground. Over the past 3 years, because of COVID restrictions, which we've all had these restrictions, the Manor House has been closed to the public, but we hope to resume a limited number of house tours this summer as we begin an architectural restoration project also funded by the Mellon Foundation. The Sylvester Manor House has been a living family home since it was built in 1737 until the last family member died there in 2006. And through 2020, it was the residence of our annual farm crew and the office space for our staff. Although it is an historic home recognized by the National Register of Historic Houses, it retains a feeling of being lived in. There was a presence felt throughout the rooms, and the staff frequently talked to the house. telling it what events or visits are coming up, and announcing our arrivals and departures. It makes being there a little bit more comfortable if everybody knows what's happening. Throughout the past 18 months, we have found new ways to tell our stories online using our website, virtual exhibitions, walking tours and apps, and social media, which has allowed us to reach a wider audience. We are engaged with other historical sites on the East End of Long Island, and organizations working to uncover, share, and interpret the history of the enslaved and the free people of color. Because although their stories are not commonly known, records of their names and clues to their lives are available in plain sight in documents and archives, revealing their roles in shaping not just the areas in which they lived, but in the context of the history of our region and our nation. Among those stories that we tell, and I call myself a historical storyteller as opposed to a historian, because that's what I feel I am. We tell the stories of Hannah Jacaro and their daughters, Hope and Isabel, who were brought to Shelter Island in 1653 from Barbados and were the first family of African descent on Shelter Island. They lived in bondage for the rest of their lives and are buried in the burial ground. Tamaru and his wife Oyo, who were both born in Africa and brought to live in enslavement at Sylvester Manor. Their children included a man named Obium, who was sold and sent to live at Lloyd's Manor, also on Long Island. Obium's son, Jupiter Hammond, became the first published American poet in 1761. David Hempstead, a Black man enslaved in the neighboring town of Southold, who in freedom became the farm manager at Sylvester Manor and went on to own 95 acres of his own land on the island. His descendants were the founding members of the Eastville community in Sag Harbor. And Julia Havens Johnson, who was a free-born biracial woman who worked for 3 generations of the manor's owners. She inherited land from her stepfather, which was swindled away from her by various family members. Julia is the only person of color we have a photograph of who had lived at the manor, and she was the last known person buried in the burial ground in 1908 at close to 100 years of age. No marker marks her grave. As the Director of History and Heritage, I'm dedicated to uncovering the facts and facets of these lives and of the people, all the people who lived here, and telling their stories, which promotes our dialogue and insights into our history. And as a member of the Northern Slavery Collective, we work with other historical sites throughout New York, sharing our experiences, planning programming, and better sharing and telling the full story of slavery in New York and in the North. Thank you so much.
That's beautiful. Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Lodge, and I'm on the educational programming for the Greenwich Historical Society in Costco. So today I'm here to talk a little bit about second steps. What you do once you've done your research, you've interpreted your space, you've put on your big exhibit. Now what do you do with all of these things that you've learned? So some background, like everyone else, I'm going to tell a bit of the story. So the Greenwich Historical Society, where I work, is the caretaker of the Bush Holly House Historic Site. It's named after 2 families, the Bushes, who lived there in the decades founding the American Revolution, and the Hollies, who ran an Impressionist art colony around the turn of the century. Now, for most of our history, we just interpret the site to the colonial history of the Bush family, because that's what fits into school curricula. But in the 90s, we started to add the history of the colony, the art colony, and the Hollies, leading to what is now continually a dual interpretation of the site where both families' stories are told. But it was also around this time in the late 90s that the staff realized that we still weren't telling the full history of the site. It had long been known that the Bush family enslaved people. It was mentioned in passing in both adult tours and school tours, but it was mostly glossed over. This was partially because the particulars weren't known, but also because it made people uncomfortable. The details did exist in our records, but no one had taken the time to put them together and paint a picture of what they meant as a collective. So in 2000, an in-depth study was conducted. A list of 15 enslaved individuals was formed, an understanding of the laws was developed, and a plan to do more on our site was hatched. We would make an interpreted enslaved quarters in the space where it appeared from our records where these individuals had lived. And in this space, we would tell their story. Now, some of our board was pleased, but an equal number was concerned about the idea of talking about slavery, said it was distasteful, controversial, and a blatant pandering to the politically correct, which might sound familiar to many of you here 25 years later. But the staff at the time stood their ground and continued to present the facts. And the facts were indisputable. These 15 individuals lived on the site. So in 2002, the interpreted enslaved quarters was made and open to the public. And the story of slavery became a permanent feature of every house tour given on our site. It was a great triumph and honestly kind of ahead of its time, being just about in the year 2000. So it went. Tours happened in 2012. The slave dwelling project stayed on the site, reigniting some interest. But for the most part, slavery was acknowledged, but the study and focus on it had disappeared after that initial push. When I started in 2019, I was really excited to be a part of an institution that was willing to tell this sort of story. However, I was soon disappointed by the realities of it. No one on staff could name more than 3 or 4 of the 15 people enslaved on our site. Docents would find ways to talk about other things while in the enslaved quarters. A very popular topic was different types of beds. Yes. On tours, docents would insist that the bushes were kind and gentle enslavers. And despite there being no evidence to indicate so, and despite 20 years of progress in the field of slavery research, the language on our site had not progressed with the times and stayed as it was in the early 2000s. So in the almost 20 years since the big push to tell the story of slavery on our site, we had become content. We had ticked the box. We had acknowledged our history, and that was seen by many as enough. Most historical societies at the time were not doing that yet. So in the minds of our board, we were still ahead of the game. There was no need to worry, and there was no need to do more. This leads us to the big question I wish to propose. What do you do after this push? What do you do when you've done the research, when you put on the exhibit, when you've changed your interpretive space? How do you prevent all the work and research you have done from going into a box? How do you prevent this gained knowledge from becoming a footnote in your offering? A big show cannot be your end goal. If it is, things will begin to stagnate. Knowledge will end there, and 10, 15 years down the line, you'll have someone coming in and asking your staff, who were these people? And they will not be able to give you the names. You have to continue. So programming is the answer. It's that really important second step. When I started at the Greenwich Historical Society, there was no offered program on the history of slavery. So I created 2. I made a slavery in Connecticut tour aimed at a middle school audience. And I conducted a more extensive partnership with the Witness Stones Project, which is a nonprofit based in Connecticut that partners with historical societies and schools to create memorials for enslaved people in the towns where students live, and students help with that research. So these new programs obviously did require research. And it turned out that the research done in 2000 was only the surface of a very, very deep well. Our collection of documents pertaining to those enslaved on our site went from about 12 documents to well over 100. And that well continues to grow each and every year as we continue these programs. With all the new knowledge found and new programs in the work, that meant our docent staff had to be trained. I took the chance to work from the bottom up, reforming a baseline of language, laws, and sensitivities. Then every year since, we have done a training where we focus on 1 or 2 of the individuals enslaved on our site and conduct a deep dive into their stories so docents know their histories inside and out and feel like they know them as individuals. The results have been astounding. Docents now know everyone's name. There are no more talking about beds in the enslaved quarters. And instead of the stories of Patience and Cull and their children, all the others being encompassed only in that enslaved quarters space, their contributions to the house are pulled out throughout the house tour in every space. Our History in Connecticut tour is now tied, Slavery in Connecticut tour is now tied for our most popular school program. Every 8th grader in town, plus from surrounding towns, comes to participate in this program. 6 memorial stones have been placed on our site for those who were enslaved. 4 more are being placed next month, with our goal to add stones for all 15 individuals before moving on to the town at large. There are talks of further updates to our interpreted space to better help this story. We found descendants of those enslaved on our site, reached out to them and made a connection, right? And we've made some great friends here on the NorSC committee. So slavery went from being a footnote to a centerpiece of our interpretation. Now, none of this is easy. I had pushback from the board when I began my programs. I was told that the information we did was already more than adequate, and the additions that I wanted to add would make the Bush family look bad. I had pushbacks from the docents who are either uncomfortable or unwilling to learn new information. And interestingly, when the pandemic came and went, it is mostly these docents who chose not to return. What I did not have trouble with was the schools and the students. Once these programs became public offerings, teachers were interested. They found the topic to be important and found ways to incorporate it, even though Northern slavery is not on the Connecticut school curriculum. They found ways to fit it in. And the students have been nothing but wonderful. Young people have a deeply integrated sense of justice. And that is reflected in the respect shown by usually very rambunctious middle schoolers when they come on these tours. So my takeaway for you is to have a plan of continued and active movement. Once you have begun your journey, created the research, convinced your board, made the exhibit, make sure that you are also creating something that will continue to grow. If you stop after step 1, this information will stagnate and disappear. Starting up again will not be easy. It will almost be as difficult as the first time you did it. But if you have your second step in mind as you complete your first, you can keep the stream running and you continue to focus on these forgotten histories for decades to come. And that's it.
Thank you all very much, and thank the audience as well. Meredith and Donnamarie and Heather. Heather, I'm glad it's not working for you. We're retraining the staff. It's fabulous. We would hopefully now you have after this first half hour, 45 minutes, you have a good idea or some idea about NorSC, what it is, and some examples from our representatives. So what we would like to do now is, based on what you've heard, you may have heard some other stuff about us before. If you are a site or you work at a site and you are dealing with interpretation of enslavement or reinterpretation, if you are doing research in this area, we would welcome your questions or comments. And I say this is part of what we try to do with the Northern Slavery Collective. So we'll open the floor. Please speak clearly and loudly, and we have someone, and please introduce yourselves.
Yeah.
We'll get to Cordell. Yes, go ahead.
My name is Zoe Van Nostrand. I work for the History Center in Tompkins County, which is located in nearby Ithaca. And one of the questions that I have is that for historic spaces that are dealing on generally niche history, which is very site-specific history, when the historic sources that you have, particularly about Black Americans, enslaved Americans, are very minor, and you regularly have to reference older documents who do not have improved language, who have not changed their language from the 50s, 60s, 90s, but you also don't necessarily have the sources or resources to find someone to republish a work with better language. How do you use that as source material when it is sometimes the only thing you have access to, but it is problematic to like assign as a class reading, even if it's the only published work that exists? How do you how are some ways to navigate that or to include it in curricula when you're like, I know this is hard and we don't fully support it, but we haven't yet found somebody to create a better story of Black history in our specific space?
Wow.
Anybody? Yeah, go.
No, I don't have a good answer for you. Yeah. I was just gonna say that because we're recording this, we just make sure we repeat the question before you go ahead and answer it.
Give a small attempt. So I'm not working with things that were written in the 50s that feel a bit more contemporary, but I do a lot of original source documents with middle schoolers and high schoolers. And as one might imagine, the language in a document written in the 1800s is not nice. So we always do a preface with our students where we acknowledge that the language is there. We say that we are going to be reading it, but together as a group, these are not words that we are going to be saying. And we explain the why. And most students, when they are explained why, they understand that. And we're able then to get to the information that is inside these documents around the language. It doesn't super help for like a 1950s thing, but it's a starting point.
I don't even mean 1950s, and sometimes mean the 2000s.
Mary Liz, yeah, introduce yourself and
Mary Liz Stewart, Underground Railroad Education Center based in Albany. If I'm hearing you correctly, what I think about is that these kinds of documents that hold very problematic language open up for us the opportunity to talk with others about the power of language.
Yes.
Which is far more pervasive than just what we're dealing with in our documents, but the document, of course, provides the data, if you will, to open that door. And so that's how we address such things.
I want, Cordell had his hand raised. I'll get, Cordell, you had your hand raised? Yes, go ahead.
Cordell Reed, New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. I work with a number of sites within the state historic system, and so some of them I provided individual staff training for their staff, and I wanted to ask about your techniques for managing discomfort. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time on is trying to help people manage their own discomfort around what they're sharing with the public. And I wanted to know if any of you, just open to the full panel, have any specific techniques that you use or refer to help that process, to help people work through what they are thinking, what they are feeling, as they're trying to present this history to the public.
Right. Good one. I'll go first. Go ahead. Because Sylvester Manor has always acknowledged that this is our history of speaking about the three cultures that were brought together on our site, it's always been part of our language that has evolved. And so working there, this is what you need to talk about, and this is what you need to be comfortable with. That said, as we have engaged in deeper and deeper research and expanded our stories to be more than just, as Heather said, just the beginning or just the elevator pitch, 2 or 3 sentences, it is important that everyone be comfortable with it, because for us, especially for me, I want the staff and I want our board members to be our ambassadors. They are ambassadors to tell our story about our site to the public, to donors, to funders, to potential other board members. And that is a challenge. Sometimes not so much because they're resistant, but because it's a lot to learn. It's a lot of information. And so I'm constantly sort of updating the narrative or giving in-house kind of talks to the staff, to the board, and bringing them up to date about, I have a new chapter to the story that we've been telling for so long. Every year I rewrite the tour. We no longer have docents. That's sort of a casualty of the pandemic. But every year when we did have docents, I would rewrite the narrative to include new research, new language, new information, new way to tell the stories. Since the pandemic, I've been doing history walking tours because we're not bringing the public in the house and walking people through the trails and the woods and telling the story of enslavement within the landscape, which has made an enormous difference. It has also caused the public at some times to say unfortunate things, like, oh, it's so beautiful here. It wouldn't have been so bad to be a slave here, which just makes you cringe and makes other people on the tour sort of faint. Look at that sunset. It's so gorgeous. Wouldn't you have liked to have been here even if you had to be a slave? Really? But it's a way, and all of us have experienced that. And so that kind of reality within our staff and our board has made it, the pandemic had a lot of advantages in a lot of ways. The way that we told our story, the reach that we had, the more visitors who came to actually just walk the land, the more engagement and questions about the stories that we tell, and not just for the history and heritage staff, but for our staff and our board as a whole, and gave them that opportunity to be able to use that skill, those skills that I'm trying to teach them and the language I'm trying to teach them, and they did become more comfortable with it. But it is definitely an ongoing, it never stops. It's something that just never stops.
I'd like to just add something to that.
Sure.
One thing that I think we found on our staff is, so adding this to our narrative at the museum was something that was new. It's not something that had always existed. So that's an immediate, real change in focus there. But one thing that I think that we found that was really useful for us as a staff was to sort of get to know everyone a little bit more on a personal level, the staff, and really understand what their own experiences are and understand where they're coming from. I've found that helped us have a much more open dialogue amongst the staff, which then, of course, rolls over into having a conversation with the public. If you really understand kind of where they're coming from and what their experience with this information might be.
Martha, you had your hand raised.
I did. Martha Swan, John Brown Lives. Thank you. I am so excited about this collective, and this panel so far has been wonderful. So thank you. Sort of apropos of what Mary Liz was saying about language, I would love your reaction to this idea. I was at a conference a couple of months ago on teaching slavery and racism in US schools. And throughout the course of the day, I kept hearing the hard history, the difficult history, the difficult history. And I said, well, yes, of course. But if we keep talking about it that way, it puts up an immediate sort of psychological resistance. And so I think about the unifying potential of our very difficult, very hard history. And I just wonder what your reaction to that is.
Oh, that's good. I think for me, I don't approach it as hard history. The acknowledgement that the slavery existed in the North, any form of enslavement, people held in bondage is an abomination. I'm engaged in telling the stories of the people who actually lived in this place. And I consider them to be the founding families, men, women, and children of the place that we live. And so making it a community story, a community history, changes it for me from being difficult and depressing and sad to being one of, this is what happened to this group of people, to this individual whose story and whose name I'm going to tell you, who had these children, who lived in this place, who did this work in this time and are buried right here. and you're never going to be able to forget her name or his name. And their lives is a celebration. They endured, they survived, they went on to have multiple children who had multiple children and had descendants in this community and were a part of the history of this place. And so moving it from this terrible, terrible, terrible thing that we can't talk about and so sad, it's so depressing and so horrible that I don't want to deal with it, to this is a celebration. I want when students come, Black, white, whatever, I want them to leave knowing that these people who live in the place that you call home were fighters, were survivors, were resistors, and that we are to celebrate and respect and honor them. That's what this means. And so elevating it to that level makes it much easier, not easier, but it makes it better community-wise. It makes it more inclusive for us. It's not easier, but I want everyone to leave knowing that David Hempstead was a man of honor. His obituary, the first line of which said, David Hempstead, a well-respected colored man. Now, in 1843, that's quite a headline. And so for everyone to acknowledge that this is, okay, so the language, we know that, you know, we don't say colored anymore, but he was a well-respected man of his community. And that's the takeaway that I want for all of our stories and all of our acknowledgements.
If I can add to that, I give a number of classes on the history of slavery and anti-slavery in the Mid-Hudson Valley to college level adults, lifetime learning groups, et cetera. And what I have tried to do to make the history of slavery in our community real is I start with the Middle Passage.
Mm.
And I try to show the connection between the extent, 12.5 million Africans brought over to the Americas, the conditions on the Middle Passage, and then give them examples of enslaved Africans coming right to New York City, up to Albany and Orange, right up the Hudson River where they live. They lived here. And slave ship the Charles in 1688 came across the Atlantic with 145 Africans, and about 40 of them perished. Where'd they go? And so I tried to make that connection first, that slavery is real. It was real. It's not just something that happened in the South. They were coming right up the Hudson River and they were stopping here, the Livingstons. Then I bring it down to some familiar names in the Mid-Hudson area, like the Livingstons and others, and then begin to parse out. Because remember one thing, 1619, oh, that's the big deal, right? 1626, New York, New Netherlands. That's the same year. We were first. You could say that we're one of the first. New York didn't lag behind. So what I try to do is talk in the beginning about some of the really harsh stuff, like some of the laws in the Southern colonies that said only Black people could be enslaved. A white person could not become a slave. So then I build out a lot of the positive stuff as enslaved people. Take for another example, and then I'll stop. Runaway slave ads. Oh my goodness, look at South Carolina, Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. Do you know that in the Mid-Hudson Valley, there were over 1,000 freedom seekers? This is not a foreign topic. This is right here in our own backyard. So I think that helps because it makes it's not foreign to them.
Yeah.
And
Gentlemen,
yes.
Saladin Rock, that's
Yes.
I think one thing to keep in mind is
maybe we're doing a little bit too much talking. And what I mean by that is one of our signature programs that we do our facilitated dialogue tours. We don't do a bunch of talking and people standing there nodding their heads and we don't know what's going on in their heads. We utilize our content as the basis for facilitated dialogues. For example, when you were talking about the graveyard, right? I would talk to people on my tour and ask them, have they ever visited a graveyard before? Give them an opportunity to share. And if you did visit a graveyard, what did the headstone look like?
Mhm.
Right? Now imagine if you had a family member and there was no headstone. How would you feel about that?
Exactly.
How would you feel? And when you get people to participate in that, they take a sense of ownership.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we have this philosophy that one size fits all with content, when that is not true. You have to meet people where they are, whether they're a historian coming to the space to fact check everything, or if it's a third grader. You have to
Absolutely.
figure out where you can meet them where they're actually at. And a lot of it is based upon that being participatory. You know, the same thing that was mentioned about language. Sometimes, especially with younger people, you can use the correct terminology and point to the word and say, well, that's what this actually means. That's why it was used during that time period
Right.
for this actual reason, right? And then tie it into something contemporary. How would you like being called this, that, or the third? Or how does it feel when people use this language around you in school? So when you make it like that, it's more personal and it's more participatory.
Absolutely.
And you're gonna meet people where they are all of the time, as opposed to expecting people to meet you on your level.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Where did you say you were from?
Niagara Falls Underground Railroad area.
Yes, sir, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in a piece. So there's. this-
Can you identify
Oh, I'm
yourself?
sorry, I'm Paul Stewart. I'm with the Underground Railroad Education Center in Albany. What you're all doing, what many of us are doing, I think is really, really important because we're recapturing something that is lost in the discussion. But I'm anxious not to forget that period between 1799, 1798 and 1827 and 1860 and so forth. There's a lot of culture, a lot of expression, et cetera, that went on during that time period that's still under the shadow of slavery. And so just not to forget that chapter in the story that, while people were, largely past the end of enslavement in New York, because of New York's emancipation in 1827, there was still a federal fugitive slave law. There was still slavery in the South that dictated how people had to behave in the North. And even in the midst of that, there were literary societies and cultural societies, and debate societies, and newspapers being published, and economic development projects being developed, voting rights being struggled for. All of this,
Right.
yes, in the cloud of enslavement as well.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, gentleman in the back has.
Yes, my name is Peter Wisby. I'm from the Genesee Country Village and Museum in Mumford. We're a living history site near Rochester. One of our buildings that's been moved to our site was the home of Nathaniel Rochester, his first home in the Genesee region. He moved in 1811 with members of his family to Dansville and his enslaved persons in the household. We are in the process of the research stage of things. And thinking along ahead how we do our interpretation. Some of it, though, as the founder of Rochester, there's 100 years of veneration that built up along with him. So we're considering how that we kind of retell that story of Rochester. He continued to buy and sell enslaved people, even while he lived in New York State, right up until 1827, from his connections in Maryland. So we're not a good guy. We're myth busting and thinking about how we tell this story of kind of prolonged enslavement, even after manumission, he
Wow.
indentured his people to continue to utilize their labor. So we're, trying to figure out how, after the research stage, which I hear research all along. And clearly that's the first step is to uncover those stories. The second step is then how are we going to interpret this space and give voices to these people? And that's our next challenge. So I really appreciate this group and to hearing your success story. I think that's wonderful, and we look to be part of that as well.
Thank you.
One thing I'll add, just so nobody forgets. We've got some information here at the front. We've got a sign up sheet for our mailing list. So, please stop by and sign up for that so we can continue this conversation.
Gentleman in the back.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mario Martinez from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. I just wanted to add, first of all, that it was great. I heard a lot of things that I had no idea about. I wanted to ask, what has your involvement been with building descendant communities? And preface that I've already talked to Meredith about this before, and congratulations on your appointment.
Thank you.
If you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, back in 2018, we were able to produce the rubric, the Interpreting Slavery and Descendant Communities rubric, and a lot of us across out in the trust and outside the trust have been slowly trying to implement those things. But I haven't heard as much from our brothers and sisters in the North, and so I'm wondering if what have you not been able to do?
Right. Well, I always say we don't have a descendant community of African-American descendants yet. I firmly believe, I hope, I wish that the more and more we tell the stories, the more we have exposure. Someone doing genealogy will say, I got a name here from Eastern Long Island. I wonder if these folks can help me, and they'll come up the driveway and my work will be done here. But so far that has not happened. And so what I'm engaged in now, and this next part of my project, is to engage the local community. Sylvester Manor is on Shelter Island, on the east end of Long Island in the Hamptons. The community in Sag Harbor, where I live, east of Eastville, is known as the Sands communities. It's the historical African-American communities within Sag Harbor, which is a resort site, the second home site of African-American families beginning post-World War II. And so I'm trying to engage them as our resident descendant community to become more engaged in the historical history of the region within which they live, and to identify with it. Until such time as I have possibly, hopefully, a descendant community. We are also from Sylvester Manor and Shelter Island and other East End historical sites, specifically in Sag Harbor with Georgette Burkey, who is the director of the Eastville Community Historical Society, where some of those original residents were the second and third generations of enslaved people who came to Sag Harbor for the whaling industry from Shelter Island, and specifically from Sylvester Manor. So in being able to expand our stories generationally, which is something that's very important to me. These people did not live here in a vacuum just to say that so-and-so was enslaved in this place in this time, end of story. No, they had descendants, and their descendants have a story to tell as well within the region. And so from that, we're trying to build a descendant community of place. Levada, I'm sorry. I was just
So I was going to say, I'm in the learning phases of this. So all of us here are also on a journey where we are continuing to grow. So we found our first descendant from our site about a year ago. I was speaking on the local news about the work we were doing. I was telling the story about Cull and Patience and their children. And about a week later, we get an email from a woman saying, I know those names. That's my family. how can I get into contact with you? Which was immediately thrilling and terrifying, because this is going to be one of the relationships that matters most with our interpretation, is something that has to be done carefully and respectfully. And I was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? I emailed her. I was like, hi, I would be so happy to talk with you. I want to reach out. I want to tell you everything we've learned. I want to learn everything that you know. I'm really excited. And then she didn't email me back. So we have a woman who is a descendant of another enslaved family who's been one of my research consultants for years. She's incredible. And I emailed her. I'm like, Teresa, I think I scared her away. What do I do? Can you call her? And she was very nice, and she did. And she was like, okay, this woman is fantastic. She was a little intimidated because she didn't realize you guys were a museum, but she's ready to talk. And here's her number, not her email, here's her phone number. So I called her up, and she cried, and then I cried, and then she cried again, and then I cried again. And we talked on the phone for 4 hours, sharing everything we knew. And at the end of it, she was like, I know where my people are. I need to come, I need to meet you, I need to see this. I grew up half an hour away, but I don't live close anymore, and I don't know when I'm going to be able to do this. But I'm going to keep in contact with you, and one day I'm going to bring my whole family to the site, my parents, my children's, my brothers, my sisters. We're still working on that.
Okay.
But it's there. So since then, we've been in constant dialogue with each other whenever I find more information on the family. And because we do have these continual research projects, we are finding new information every year. For example, just a couple months ago, I found the funeral records for several of her family members. And what I do is I immediately email them over to her. This is her family. She has a right to anything we find. And in turn, she sends me things that she finds. And for now, it's that continual dialogue as we're learning about each other, as we're figuring out what we're going to do next. I don't know what the next step is. It's a little frightening, but it's also really exciting. I can't give more advice than that, than be open and be true and welcome them.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, I love it.
So I hate to break it, such a great conversation. I just wanted to do this sort of the 10-minute warning. We're come to the end of the formal time for this session. And I do ask you to take that evaluation sheet out and fill it out. There's also a QR code in here. It's Survey Monkey. But just in the next few minutes, we just pay a little attention to that evaluation. Very helpful, man. Thank you. Certainly take a few more questions.
Ravada, would you like to? Can you stand up?
In terms of descendant communities, we're doing a couple of things. One, the best that we can do is to do the research, find the names, and then start to share that with the public. We also have to, in our area, redefine what is descendant community. In New York, particularly when we look from Albany going south, because of the large influx of people from the Great Migration and the cost of real estate, we have through this period a huge, also happens in central and western New York, Black flight out of New York. So one of the things that a lot of sites are doing is, one, reestablishing the connections that New York has with the Caribbean and the West Indies. Many of our sites now are sitting in neighborhoods of immigrants, but in relearning New York history, we know that we are an area of merchant traders. Our product goes into the West Indies, goes into the Caribbean. So we can pull on that same history. I know the first time I was at Dyckman in the kitchen, so many people from the DR came in and said, oh, I know those pots. I used to do cooking like that. And then we can reconnect New York to those other diaspora communities, and they become our descendant communities. And all over the state right now, we have people going back to the historic record, finding the names, A lot of the work that my colleagues are speaking of and that you are doing is research that's less than 20 years old. Most of it is less than 40 years old. So in many cases, we are not referring to the book, we're going back to the documents themselves. So that whole evolution, the more we speak to those names, the more we look out for those names, the more we share even just the presence of enslaved at these various sites, people are then starting to say, this was my family. But one of the challenges in this descendant conversation as well is we have that index of people who want to remove the enslavers' names. We want to take them off the street signs. We want to take them off the schools, etc. We are so new in this research that by taking away those things, we can't find the enslaved. Many times the only way we can find them is through the enslavers, because by law, enslaved here in New York do not have last. We are now finding on census records people who are still showing up without last names.
Yep.
So the whole evolution of the descendant community is very different in some ways than from the southern colonies, where people are staying in communities, or they're immediately picking up their enslavers' name and using those names as they're moving north or as they're moving to California or the Midwest. So I would encourage everyone to kind of be fluid around that concept of descendant community. For us right now, because in many areas, and particularly as we go central and western New York, where we know we had enslaved, there are no Black communities there. Right? So how do you pull on that? You pull on that by people who are interested and people who are willing to engage, whether they came up from the migration or they moved in last week. If they are interested, then we need to embrace them as our descendant community until we can reconnect those census records and names, or until people come forth and say, this was my particular family.
So in the back, oh,
Georgette.
Hi, everybody. My name is Rebecca Ricky. I'm from the Development Historical Society, but I also work on a project, the Pierce Concert Homestead. So I love that we're talking about the documents and the names. But the other thing that is really important to me is having presence in the built environment. And being able to experience those spaces that so much get knocked down or erased. And on the East End where we live, that is a very active, and I'm sure across the state. So first, I just want to acknowledge the fact that when we're in these spaces, it's important to allow people to feel with that. And as you said, taking away the bed and all these other things, like this is the space that they would have lived. This is the space, you know, that they labored. And so I think in part of telling the interpretation and programming, we often forget about that. Being in that space, you don't have to have words, just fitting and being in that space. I know many years ago at Sylvester Manor, you know, we had people come and sleep in the attic. That's very uncomfortable when there's no AC and different things like that. So I would encourage you, if you have a space and you know that there was an enslaved structure there, that you honor it. You don't let it get torn down and dismantled and gone. So one of the areas I'm working on is making sure that we are visible in that built environment, because we help build communities that they live in America as a whole. And so when I think about your Wisconsin project in the heart of Southampton, on the prime location, and others that have been erased, I would implore you to continue to advocate for those spaces, as well as the narrative, as well as the names, because I think it's important, and not for us just to look at the historic architectural buildings as significant, but also look at these spaces that they built, that they put their hands on, they studied, they lived, to also help inform us about these residents that are here, and even in turn in our cemeteries, to take care of these spaces as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Georgette.
We can do one last. I think we have time for, who hasn't spoken? Gentlemen, oh, okay.
If you have any others, yeah.
Peter Feynman, the Institute of History, Archaeology and Education. I apologize for being late, so I discussed this already. You can tell me to stop. But there is proposed Amistad legislation in Albany about, and it relates to the whole area of the teaching. You talked about the adult lifelong learners who come, but what about the K through 12? And this legislation is aimed towards bringing that into the schoolroom. So I'm just wondering if that was part of the discussion at all earlier, where we go from here. Because otherwise, it's just on an exceptional basis. You may have a teacher who's really interested in it and will make the effort to do the field trip. But if that teacher retires or that principal retires, well, there goes that trip and you're back to standard curriculum. So it's becoming part of the curriculum. That's really, I think, the key in the long term.
Right. Yeah. Anybody want to do anything or? Oh.
For those who don't know, Levada is also part of our steering committee, so she's not at the panel table, but she is a panelist.
Thank you. Yes, there is Amistad legislation. The Amistad was one of 3 commissions that have been over the last 20 years put in place to deal with the absence of Black African-American history going from the colonial period forward, not just 20th century history. The current commission, the African-American History Commission, is going back and looking at what avenues, particularly around bridging into the educational department, worked and didn't work. They're trying to move some of that information forward. They are still in a fact-finding position. I know many people consider the Amistad legislation failure, but the commission did what the commission was tasked to do, which was create a white paper. What the current commission is doing is looking at barriers around how to, in fact, get this information into the classroom. There are several avenues that are currently in place to do that. One of them is called consider the source in y.com. It's part of the Archive Partnership Trust. They're trying to be that middle ground between people who are holding documents and locations and educators, and they're helping to digitize primary documents and create curriculum that teachers can actually pick up and use from different regions of the state. So this is an ongoing process. One of the things, though, that I always encourage every site or society to do, we have to constantly go back and reintroduce ourselves to teachers, to educators, to school boards, particularly now following COVID, when so many people have retired. Do not assume that a teacher that you have a relationship with for the last 5 years come September will be in place. It has to be continuous, ongoing contact. That is the only way that we can ensure that students are coming to your site or teachers are looking for you to bring programs into the classroom. One of the things that often any historic society and site does is we rely on these long-term relationships, just assuming they're always going to be there, and they're not. We have to be proactive. We have to go out and constantly, and this is not just with the schools, this is also with our communities in general. We have to really do that kind of ground level guerrilla marketing. Meet your librarians, put the flyers up in the laundry mats, go shake their hand, but you must do this. We must do this on a regular, ongoing basis. We need to stop assuming that people are always going to be there. So above and beyond what will happen on the legislative level, above and beyond what will happen between the historic world and the Department of Education. We are all citizens of our community, and we need to be active in engaging our community on that platform.
Thank you.
That when people say it's not in curriculum, it is in the curriculum for, and the state has adopted that. You have a local history mandate. So if this is in your community, you have to teach it. That's a local history mandate in social studies.